My story takes place over 3 summers on the Front Range in northern Colorado. I grew up camping in our family spot, a place called the Neverwinter Wilderness, which was full of ghost towns and creepy abandoned mines. The place had been passed down for many generations, and I thought it was beautiful, despite some of the creepier elements. When I turned 15, I got my permit and felt grateful to be able to go to my family's lands and explore unsupervised. My first outing was a disaster by most camper standards, as I forgot most of everything and basically had some beans and hot dogs. However, I was ecstatic to be out here. It was only a few minutes after going out on my own that I started to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I quickly dismissed the notion, as I knew I was the only human out here, so if anything was watching me, it was likely a big cat or an animal of some kind. I wasn't too worried. Just to be safe, I pulled out my father's AK and loaded it. Nothing would get me like this, I thought. Near sundown, I figured I'd go out on a ridge and chill to watch the sunset. Bringing my AK and some stew, I headed up and soon saw the magnificent wonder and glory that was the sun setting on our land. After such a scenic view, I'd forgotten all about the idea that I might be being watched. Heading back down to the terrain, which was very steep, I was careful and slow in my climbing. It was at this point I heard something falling from above, but it turned out just to be a boulder. It was ahead of my way, so I didn't think much of it and took a second to catch my breath. As I was about to continue my trek, I heard a snapping sound that made me jump. It was in the direction of the boulder, but closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave now. It was because of this feeling I bolted out of there, and while I fell, tumbled, and had a few slips and slides, I mostly made it down unscathed. I dropped my back once I reached the bottom, and took a more deep breath again. I felt rather exhausted from rushing down and probably also from the adrenaline I'd gotten upon hearing the noise I'd heard. Suddenly, I feel dizzy as I sit up on my truck, trying to get my bearings. I realize I passed out again after I awake. It was a sound of nearby splashing that shot me awake. I grabbed my rifle and tried to get my bearings as I peered around almost panoramically. Looking around reveals no one and nothing. It's now when I realize, suddenly, everything has gone completely quiet. It shouldn't be this quiet. Wanting to see what made the initial splashing, I stopped myself short of checking it out at the realization it's almost dark. I start a fire and stare towards the tree line, listening closely for any sort of sound as I wait. It's only a few minutes before I hear snapping sounds again. I turn to look through my scope and some kind of visual when out of the blue a giant rock lands near me in my camp. The rock came from behind me, and so quickly, I turned around and looked back. The night sets in eventually, and I'm still up, wired, paranoid, and shaking in fear from whatever is out there, which I can still hear from time to time. Almost as though something is waiting just out of sight for me to rest again or perhaps let my guard down. After a few more hours go by, I realize it's gotten unusually quiet again. I can't take the tension, and after a bit, I put up my fire and move into the cab of my truck. I'm about to say screw this and hightail it out of there without my supplies when I remember the road out is narrow and treacherous. I wouldn't be able to risk breaking an axle or getting stranded, so I decided to wait in my truck with the doors locked. The night is long, and I can't sleep, but eventually, first light shows itself on the horizon. The moment it was light enough out, I threw my stuff in my truck and I hightailed it out of Dodge. I hate being scared, and I hate being even more made a fool of. I wanted to know that I wasn't crazy when I left. I would eventually spend 40 days out in the valley in total. I was never alone. Every time I went up there, I always felt something watching me. I built a cabin out there at one point, and when I camp out, I'd get ground rules for myself, such as never leaving the tent or my cabin for any reason at night. The nights I tried spending in a tent were the worst, but it was never nice. I would quite often see something in the distance, but I could never make out what it was. If I tried to get a better look, it'd vanish. If I was in the cabin, I'd hear something running his claws along the walls or tapping on the door at night. Every once in a while during the day, I'd catch a glimpse of something or someone watching me as I worked or chilled. I'm not sure what was out there, but there was a night where whatever it was tried to kill me. That's not a story I'm comfortable sharing quite yet. I simply wanted you to know, there's something out there in that valley. There may be more than one of whatever was watching me. Regardless, I think it pays for people to wish to camp, on my family land or not, to always bring something to defend themselves, and to always be aware of their surroundings.
I was 14 at the time, and I like to think of myself as a witch. Before I start, I have several experiences with other witches. My grandmother on my mom's side, I'm sure was a witch, and that may be where I got these odd powers of sorts from. My grandmother died when I was 3, so I don't remember much of her, but I remember 2 moments with her. The first one is random, and nothing very paranormal, but the second one, I was playing about in my granddad's back garden, and we lived with my granddad at the time. I fell and cut my leg on some rocks sitting around, and my grandmother rushed over. I remember exactly, very clearly, that I was bleeding a lot. There was blood on my tights, my shirt, my hands. Some was even on my face because I had rubbed my eyes. My grandmother knelt down next to me, rubbed her hands together, and I swear to God I saw sparks or something. They came from her hands. She put her hands over the cut, and I'm being completely serious. The cut healed and turned into a small, greenish bruise. The blood was still on my hands, but there was no trace of a cut on my leg. My mom rushed over, and I think she looked slightly angry at my grandmother when she took me inside to clean me up. I can only imagine she didn't want my grandmother exposing me to that kind of stuff. Since then, I've seen a swamp witch at a local duck and bird preserve near where I live. She looked disgusting, and when she saw me, she smiled a bit. Her teeth were solid black, and she was terrifying. I ran away screaming for my mother when she said, "Dia duit lianpa," which is Irish for "hello child." I don't understand that much Irish, but for some reason, I knew what she was saying. I know that dia duit is hello, but at the time I didn't know Irish until I started learning it by myself. While learning it, I remembered that experience, but back to the story. I ran to my mother, and when I looked back, that creepy witch with the black teeth, she was gone. My mom started pushing us along the path faster, and we left without going to the gift shop that day. But I knew it was a witch. Now I could feel it. Her eyes were the scariest part, though. They were bloodshot, and I couldn't see anything but a pupil on them. I found out I had the same kind of magic, almost, as my grandmother. When I rubbed my hands together, when it was cold and the room would slowly heat up. I was quite shocked at first. My mom walked in and commented on how the rest of the house was freezing, but my room was warm, which made me realize that she hadn't turned up the thermostat. Then one time while I was camping, I was going through part of a small forest near the camp with my brother and a friend. We reached a tree that had 4 names on it, and one name was scratched out. I remember that name the most. Naomi. I saw a knife nearby, and I put my hand on the tree over the name that was crossed out, and my hand instantly started feeling like it was burning, and the name was glowing bright white. My friend didn't see it, but my brother looked at me and had a slightly confused look on his face. I headed back to the camp after that, with a few burn marks on my hand. That night was a new moon. I find around new moons I'm weaker and I feel sick, and I can't really control my powers, so to say. On full moons I feel stronger. Yeah, I know it sounds a bit unbelievable, but hear me out. It was a new moon, of course, that night, and I stayed up later, staring at the side of the tent. My hand started hurting, so I looked at it, and a small spark was flickering near it. And when I looked, it disappeared. Some of my friends believed me when I told them that I thought I was a witch, as a few of them say that about once a month, probably on a new moon, they'd see small sparks or lights escaping from my hands. Most of my friends don't believe me and just laugh. It makes me upset, as I am not lying about any of it. Yesterday, the 4th of July as well, was a new moon, and sparks were coming from my hands again. I'll stop here for now, as this account is pretty long so far. If anyone else has these kinds of things happening, do you know how to stop it?
When I was 8, my best friend invited me to go with her camping along with her family. We've lived on the same street and still do to this day. Have known each other since we were like 2 years old or something. Desperate to get out of the house, I decided to go along. We arrived at camp around 10 at night and thought it'd be fun to try to scare people. We hid in the bushes and would jump out scaring, but also making people laugh at how cute we were for doing so. This continued until we tried to scare an older gentleman who only reacted to us with a creepy, almost pervy-like smile. This scared us and we stopped scaring people right then and there. It was dark, but the older man appeared to be white and in his 40s. He was a medium build and smelled of cigarettes and whiskey. Keep in mind this was a few years ago, so my memory isn't perfect. The man told us before we left that we shouldn't scare people because it's naughty. More disturbing was that he smiled while saying it the entire time, at which point my friend, we'll call her Faith, apologized and both ran from the man. The following day was normal until sunset when we heard someone up on the hill say, "You." Looking up, I saw no one initially and immediately yelled it back. That was when I saw the man from the night before heading down the hill towards us. I had such a good day at this point. I wasn't afraid and waited for the man to come down. This was when the man asked where our parents were. Fave told him they were at the campsite. The man gave a creepy smile and said he should walk us back as it was getting late, at which point we shot down the offer, saying it was pretty far. The man then insisted, saying he had kids and they had bikes we could borrow back at his campsite. I wanted to run at this point, but I didn't want to offend the guy, and so we followed him right up until we arrived at the campsite and realized there were no kids or bikes in sight. This was an obvious red flag. The man told us to wait here while he gets something from his trailer, at which point he went inside. Afraid, I tell Faith we can't outrun him, so we need to hide. We immediately dart over to some bushes and do just that. The man comes out of his trailer, and when he does, he isn't holding a bike. He is holding a roll of duct tape in his hands. This terrified us. I'd seen too many crime shows where people get murdered from doing stupid things like we just did. The man who previously had a creepy grin now was scowling in rage and looked for Faith and I. He does this for quite a while before giving up and going inside. The instant the man went inside his trailer, we turned and ran. We didn't stop until we got back to our campsite. When we finally arrived, we were exhausted and went to sleep, too afraid to tell Faith's parents anything. We eventually brought it up a couple days later, but nothing came of it except for the reoccurring nightmares I have to this day.
I have been a scout since I was very little, and I really enjoyed our summer camps, but this year was different. I was finally old enough to join the Night Guard Rota. I was 11 or 12. I do not remember exactly, but I knew I was ready. The task was simple. The member of your rota will come to wake you up when it was your time to switch off, and you would guard the camp for 1.5 hours. Then you will wake up another member who will switch off with you. It's 2 a.m. and my friend wakes me up for my shift. I was super excited. I was alone, sitting in the middle of the camp. The night was calm, and the sky was clear. Beautiful stars were sparkling above my head, and a light summer breeze was playing with my hair. The time was passing fast. I was sitting very close to the fire so I could catch some light for reading my old comic. Right when I turned a page, I heard some rustling noise. I looked up immediately, but I saw nothing. I thought maybe some leaves fell, so I didn't pay much attention. I returned back to reading, but then I could hear some weird growling, very clear. My heartbeat picked up. I could hear it in my head. The growling was coming from the camp. I took my flashlight and went to check it out, even though I would rather stay by the safety of the fire. I was getting very close to it. Step by step, the growling was getting louder. A weird thing was that it was not moving. It was coming from our leader's tent. It was only our leader snoring. I felt so silly for being so paranoid. I got back to the fire and I sat down. I had only 20 more minutes left. Everything was going smooth. I had a really ominous feeling. The weird noise and the growling, or snoring, it got me in a mood. I had a feeling like someone was watching me, or maybe something. I could feel the pointy eyes on my back, but when I tried to stare in the distance, I saw only darkness. But then, very strong wind came up and blew my comic right to the direction where I thought the watcher would be. I did not want to go to get it. It was only 5 meters away, but the wind blew even harder, and I couldn't see my comic anymore. There was simply no way I could get up and get it. I heard a few steps more to the right. What if there was someone, or a boar, or maybe just a fox or something? I was so scared. I decided to cheat, and I moved the time on the watch I was sharing with my rota, and went to wake up another member. I went to sleep, or at least tried to. The growling, the snoring became so loud. But this growling was different than what it was before. The main thing was it was moving, and it was very close to my tent. I could hear it. I could even feel it a few steps away. But a few moments after that, it was gone. Silence. In the morning, when I woke up, I found the comic next to my tent, and it was missing a few pages. It looked like it had been chewed. I didn't tell anyone about this experience. It has been more than 10 years ago, but it feels like yesterday.
This story occurred when I was 15, and I was a member of the Boy Scouts, so this would be around 2012. My troop got together and decided to go camping for the weekend, something we did fairly often. The camp we chose didn't have many people or cars around, and was rather secluded. Having no worry of other campers in the area, we made a giant campfire and had a late night. When our campfire finally died out, we went to our tents to get some much-needed rest. Strangely, this night, I was unable to sleep because I was just laying there for some reason. I was listening to the sounds of nature around my tent, hoping to fall asleep. It was right when I was dozing off that I heard something near our campsite. There was a very loud rustling in the forest that was quickly making its way towards our campsite. After a minute of movement, I heard something stop about 7 or so feet away from my tent, before suddenly darting off into the forest. My mind racing and paralyzed by fear, I was scrambling to think of what could have been at the campsite. In time, my brain rationalized it was probably one of the adults checking on us, and as such, I relaxed for a little bit, listening to the sound slowly move off into the distance. It wasn't long after this that I crashed. It was sometime late in the middle of the night when I noticed once again that I awoke to something wandering around our camp. It was close, but eventually, it went off towards the same direction as the noise did the previous time. Too curious for my own good, I looked out the mesh window of my tent. It was then that I froze in terror. There was a huge, black figure standing near the tent that was way too large to be any of the other scouts. It had no flashlight and just stood there menacingly, looking around the camp. I tried to calm myself as I watched the figure unzip another tent, seemingly peering in before a high-pitched scream was heard. This immediately woke everyone else up, who started coming out of their tents and freaking out. The figure itself darted into the forest, never to be seen again. The adult soon checked on us, and when questioned, many of the other boys mentioned a figure that looked like it could have been a man wearing dark clothing. Unfortunately, though, none of us could get a good enough view to be sure. The other scouts also mentioned hearing the rustling in the grass. Disturbed at this news, we were all moved to the adult campsite, where they all slept in shifts, watching in case this creeper returned. The following morning, we left after our chaperones alerted the park rangers and sheriff. We never returned to that site, and from what I understand, they never found the guy that was lurking in our camp, if it was a guy at all. My story takes place a couple of years ago when I went on vacation with my friend Sarah and her family. I'm originally from Texas, but the events mentioned occurred in Tennessee. Sarah's family and I went on a road trip for the summer, and all was going pretty awesomely. On the second day of the trip, Sarah's mom allowed Sarah and I to go ziplining by ourselves. When we arrived at the spot we were supposed to go ziplining, we saw a bunch of people from all age ranges, ready to do the same thing. The instructor began lining us up and dividing us by van numbers, as our group was big enough to warrant several vans taking us to the spot where we'd be ziplining. While we waited in line, Sarah and I noticed a man ahead of us trying to take a selfie with a rather large camera. His camera was at such an angle that you could see us. After noticing us, the man turned around and smiled. We all laughed, and we began talking to the man, who was wondering where we were from and if we were tourists in the area. And didn't think much of this and just figured the guy wanted to do some small talk, and so we told him where we were from. This was when the man told us he was 22 and traveling the roads, which we thought was super cool. Soon enough, the instructor had us get into the vans. I was first, followed by Sarah. There was a woman who was next, but the dude we were chatting with suddenly cut her in line. He got a seat next to Sarah. We eventually were all filled up and the van began moving. The guy continued talking to us, which was when I began to feel a little bit weird about everything. The guy's questions were becoming more detailed. He asked Sarah what her name was, and I quickly tried to cut them off, warning her not to give out her name. Naturally, she didn't listen. I refused to give my name out. The questions, for which he now directed at Sarah, soon began to turn to things like what was her Snapchat and her Instagram. This made me even more suspicious, as we told him that she was 14 and he is 22. Why in the hell would he want to know about Instagram and Snapchat anyway? After this, he took things a step further and asked if we'd take a picture with him. I quickly turned the guy's offer down and then tried to get Sarah to do the same, but she ignored my caution and took pictures with the guy anyway. When we arrived at the campsite and got to the instructor, she began telling us the rules and giving us directions on what to do next. Sarah and I moved up front to hear better. As we did, the camera guy slowly worked his way behind us. It was now that Sarah was finally starting to get an off vibe about the guy, so we continued moving back and forth among the group trying to ditch the dude. The guy continued following us back and forth, and upon hearing the instructor ask who wanted to go first, Sarah and I immediately volunteered, hoping to put as much space between us and that dude as possible. As predicted, however, the dude quickly moved up to be the one to go right after us. Freaked by this, we talked to the instructor, who then left the people in front of him to break us all apart. After ziplining, the dude eventually got caught up to us again. Worry for me and Sarah's safety, I called the guy out on his stalking ways. This made the guy get defensive and throw his hands up in the air, but he did back off. The rest of the day was fine after this, and thankfully on the way back the guy purposely took a different van, so as not to creep us out, I guess. We've learned from our experiences. The best thing we can say, though, is if you're ever in any trip, always be careful on who you let close. Who knows what would have happened if we didn't confront that guy. I like not thinking too much about it though, because it could have gone really bad.
This happened to me a couple of years back when we first moved to Ohio. You probably know Ohio for its major cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati, but outside of town there's nothing but trees and, well, more trees. We moved from an apartment complex to an old cabin because my mom wanted to get out of town. I know it sounds stereotypical to move to a creepy cabin, but it's true. You're probably wondering then, why would we move to such a creepy place? Well, my mom wanted to be able to sit out on the front porch and sip coffee in peace. Well, I always wanted to go out and make things, discover things, and just have fun. But on the inside, I did have a fear of something out there. My sister, who is a couple of years older than me, wanted to hang out with her friends. She hated going outside and actually doing things, which is unfortunate, because I wanted someone to play with. Luckily for me, though, I had my black dog, Fluffy. She's a black lab, with a touch of white on her chest, and she was really soft as a puppy, so that's how she got her name. She'd often run off, but she would always come back later. So I stopped worrying about her eventually. My dad moved with his side of the family, who lives somewhere west. I honestly forgot where exactly. It's been so long. So it's just me, my mom, and my sister, Mo. Now that I get that out of the way, this is my encounter with a creature that still has gone unexplained. My sister and I were camping outside of the cabin. For some reason, she is always cooking marshmallows over the stove in the house. It's a good idea, they're tasty, but it's odd. Since she likes marshmallows and I'm basically a pyromaniac, we decided to camp outside, right where our yard meets the trees, and start a fire. After we had our fair share of marshmallows and hot dogs, I slept inside my sister's car. Because we didn't have a tent, she just went inside the house to sleep. I woke up to the sound of bushes crackling and rustling. I don't know what time it was because I didn't have anything to check, but the lights in the house were out except for the porch lights, so everyone must have been asleep. I sat up from the passenger seat and tried to focus my eyes in the darkness outside. The bush that was moving was right by the passenger door, which was where I was sleeping. After listening and looking out the window for a solid 10 minutes, I decided that I was going to try to get back to sleep. But I started to hype myself up. I rounded up the courage to hop out of the car and run for it. I made it to the back porch and turned and looked to see if I was being followed. But I still couldn't see everything very well. It was so dark. All I could see was the red-hot coals of the fire we made. Then I turned to open the door, but I heard something running towards me. It almost sounded like hooves, but not four, just two. And they weren't very consistent. I looked back and saw a tall thing almost limping very quickly towards me. It had long hair that was bouncing behind it, but it looked clumped together and very matted in the silhouette. I twisted the door handle, but it was locked, of course. Running around the side of the house, I was thinking, why would she lock the door when she knew I was outside? What if I got hungry or thirsty? But I quickly lost that thought when I remembered what was happening. I reached the front door and got the spare key. Then I unlocked it and ran inside, throwing the door shut behind me and locking it. I heard the now slow footsteps of the thing walking outside the window. Peeking through the blinds, I was able to get a good look at it in the porch light. And it had very thin legs, with hooves. It definitely wasn't human, but I couldn't see its face, and I'm glad I couldn't. I thought for a couple of minutes, then I remembered that my mom had her cell phone, and I could call 911. I ran upstairs to my mom's room, but she wasn't there. Before I could even worry, something was pounding on the front door. I hid in my room for 10 minutes, wondering all the while, what do I do? Then I heard my mother calling me from downstairs. She was very angry. Apparently the pounding on the door was my mom, and she said she couldn't find the spare key. That's because I took it inside with me. She went to the nearest gas station to get some medicine for my sister because she felt sick. My sister had to crawl through the window to unlock the door for my mom. The creature itself was nowhere to be found. Only muddy hoof prints were left behind. I remember those footprints, which was enough proof to my mom that something really did happen, that my experience, though wild, was true. Sometimes my mom isn't very convinced, and other times I think she's in denial. But when something happens to her, I know we'll be living in those apartments again pretty soon. I was 14 years old, and it was Memorial Day weekend, so I was invited to go camping with my friends, Will, Matt, and Jake. I'm from St. Louis, so I rarely go hiking, and it was my second time sleeping in a tent outdoors. On Saturday, we went ATV riding on the trail paths, did some airsoft, and did a little fishing. It was around 11 at night when we finished our campfire that we decided to go to bed. We had 2 tents, one for Will, Jake, and Jake's father, and one for me and Matt. I woke up around 3:30 in the morning to hear rustling, heavy walking, and stuff from the campsite getting knocked around. I thought maybe someone was up and tired. Well, I thought they were tired, because they probably wouldn't knock stuff around if they were wide awake. The next thing that happened took a huge turn, and it scared the hell out of me. I zipped open the tent window, and to my surprise, it was none of my friends. What I saw was a humanoid figure, 8 to 9 feet tall, hairy, and had wide shoulders. I sat there scared to death, looking at this thing in shock. Matt woke up and asked me what I was doing. I said quietly, "Look over there. What is that?" He was equally freaked out. He replied, "I don't know, man." All of a sudden, it walked over to the other tent and started shaking and pressing on it. I was terrified for my friends. Jake's dad woke up and said, "Whoever that is, stop now." After about 10 seconds, the thing stepped back, 5 huge steps into the tree line. Jake's dad went outside with his gun and flashlight. He shined his light into the tree line. The light reflected 2 glowing eyes almost 9 feet off the ground. He started cursing at it to go away, but all it did was make weird grunting noises and started to move closer. But Jake's dad fired 2 rounds into the trees to fend it off. To our luck, it walked away. The other 2 woke up to the gunshots and asked what had happened. We told them, and they were freaked out, but not half as much as we were. When we saw the first sign of sunlight, we packed up and got the hell out of there, never returning to that area again. We told everyone back at school and home, but they didn't believe us. But 3 people experiencing it, it was better than 1 or even 2. I still get a little scared every now and then, especially when I go in the woods. I try not to think about what would happen if I went outside instead of zipping up that open window. And also if Jake's dad didn't have a gun with him. To this day, I haven't experienced anything else half as strange.